almost a decade, a team of independent scientists have been quietly examining evidence which, if verified, could change the world. Evidence that the human race is not alone. This startling possibility, based on analyses of imagery from an unmanned U.S. spacecraft, was recently presented for the first time to the international community at the United Nations in New York by Richard C. Hoagland, founder and principal investigator of this unique research effort. Hoagland, a former NASA consultant and co-creator of mankind's first interstellar message currently leaving the solar system aboard the Pioneer 10 and 11 spacecraft, was invited to deliver this address February 27, 1992, in the Dag Hammarskjöld Library Auditorium at the UN. What you are about to see was initially presented to UN delegates, staff, and invited guests. This evidence could, if verified, radically alter our perceptions of the universe, if not ourselves.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend Richard Hoagland.
Before I begin, I would like to thank several people without whom literally we would not be standing here and this would not be taking place. First and foremost, of course, Susan Caraban, who had the extraordinary misfortune to look at me in San Francisco a few months ago and say, have you ever thought of talking at the UN? Several other people, David Percy, who is our producer and friend from London, who has now been back and forth twice to do all the visuals in London that you will be seeing this afternoon. He is also going to be producing the video record of this in conjunction with Bill Cody, who is down here in front. I would like, finally, to read to you an excerpt from a letter I received a couple days ago from Boutros Ghali. Unfortunately, due to my absence from New York, I will not be able to join you on 27 February. However, I'd like to seize the opportunity to thank you for the invitation you have extended and to wish you every success in your activities. Please accept my very best wishes. Yours sincerely, Boutros Ghali, Secretary General, United Nations. So I appreciate his well wishes, and I hope we can live up to his expectation that there will be some interesting things presented this afternoon. He, of course, will get a copy of the tape, and then we will perhaps have further discussions. What I'd like to do is to begin with some prehistory. This is a very complex, very arcane subject to introduce to people who have never heard of it. It's even difficult to discuss with people who have heard of it. Because we are learning more things, and the more we learn, the more we know what we do not know. One must come at this from a position of extraordinary humility. If anyone had told me 9 years ago, which is how long I have been looking at this and asking questions and trying to get other people to do the same thing. If they had told me 9 years ago I would be standing on a stage in the Dag Hammarskjöld Library Auditorium on the afternoon of a February day in 1992, on the eve of a return mission to Mars to look at potential extraterrestrial artifacts right next door, I would have asked them if they knew Gene Roddenberry, because he needs good script. I'm going to be mentioning Gene, my dear departed friend Gene, a little later, because he too had a small piece of the puzzle and a role to play, and I hope to show you what that role has and might be in the future. But the images that I'm going to show you were taken 16 years ago, in 1976. Unmanned Viking mission, 4 spacecraft, 2 orbiters, 2 landers, went to Mars officially to search for life. But of course, we never expected we'd find anything of the caliber of what we're going to show you. Just to demonstrate how the information conduit can get mangled, there are a number of members of the press here, and there was a kind of a hurried conference up in the front hall with people who were representing the UN Department of Information, because apparently they have been getting a lot of calls from CNN and ABC and other networks and other news media asking if there was a man from Mars speaking here this afternoon. Now, make of that what you will. At the end of this presentation, you may be the judge and decide. We now have a set of data so extraordinary that it demands, in the venue of any decent science, simply testing the hypothesis. The problem is that there are some folks in NASA in charge of the next mission going back, specifically that camera I referred to, who seem less than overwhelmingly inclined to perform the simple test. They will not guarantee, strange as it may seem, that taking new pictures is on the Mars Observer agenda. They use words like luck, and if we're, lucky, we may get one picture in 2 years. Well, that, to my mind, and the mind of my colleagues and other people in this investigation, is simply not good enough, given the import of what you're going to see. So in that light, coming to the United Nations, speaking to staff, delegates, and others, and simply asking the international community to look over our shoulders, to be part of an extraordinary adventure, the end of which could be verification, absolute, that the human race is not alone, seemed to me, just in the spirit of the thing, to fall within the purview of the UN mandate and the UN Charter. Then Mohammed, serendipitously, brings out the specific resolution, 33/426. And now we know there is a legal framework. So I am very encouraged that after what you will see this afternoon, and what others will see, and what they will see through the videotapes that are being made, that we will go forward with a spirit of inquiry and verification. And if what we think is there, then truly we will have before us a new world order of the first magnitude. We're talking about nothing more and nothing less than a scientific investigation. The investigation, however, is dealing with the ineffable. It is dealing with a problem which has been uppermost in the consciousness of the human race for many millennia, if not even longer, and that is the human race, this intelligent species inhabiting the third planet of the sun, alone? Are we all there is of consciousness in a universe that stretches now billions of light years into the distance in space and time? Well, up until recently, that question had to remain merely an interesting speculation, perhaps more the purview of religion and philosophy than science. But with the development of devices like this is a radio telescope array at Socorro, New Mexico, called the Very Large Array. We have been able to intercept radio waves and radio signals from all kinds of natural processes, stars forming, galaxies exploding, planets being destroyed, new worlds being born. And amidst all that background noise and chatter and information of the universe itself, there has been this kind of forlorn hope that maybe somewhere out there, E.T. would phone home, or at least phone NASA. There, however, is another mode, and it's a mode that until recently has not received really any attention at all in the NASA community, and the mode is not signals, but artifacts. And in 1976, during the unmanned mission to Mars, the Viking mission, lo and behold, on frame 35A72, taken on an afternoon on Mars of a northern Martian desert called Cydonia, we, the human race, NASA, the United States of America, the American people who paid for the mission, spotted and noted an enigmatic artifact that did not belong, the so-called face on Mars. Now, many things have happened in the ensuing years, but I wanted to show you the original data to show you how far we have come, because, of course, the official response when this photograph was first presented to the media and to the world was that it was, in fact, a trick of light and shadow. Well, from that has come an investigation, some books, some videos, a lot of discussion, and we are here this afternoon. Now, this is a computer-enhanced version of exactly the same image done 15, 16 years later. Notice the remarkable level of detail, cross lines on the forehead, scalloping on the left side here, the suggestion of teeth in the mouth, deep-set eyes. But again, if we only had one picture, we would never know if, as NASA has said consistently for 16 years, this was merely the most marvelous trick of erosion on the surface of any planet, or, in fact, was something else. For that, you require another set of data, such as this. This is now a second frame taken 35 days after the first frame. And DiPietro and Molinari, two imaging engineers at the Goddard Space Flight Center who got into this very early on in 79 and 80, they were the ones, not NASA, to cull through the 60,000 Viking images in the archives and to find this picture. And when they processed it, lo and behold, this object turned out to be remarkably bilaterally symmetric. Now, we mean by that it seems to have a left and a right half. There appear to be two eye sockets, the mouth goes through, the hairline appears to go around, there's proportion and symmetry, about 95%. Now, facial expressions we see in mountains or in landscapes here on Earth are inevitably perspective shots, profiles, where if you move 100 meters one way or the other, they go away. What made this different was it was a frontal, full-on facial view, as if you were looking at yourself in some kind of cosmic mirror. And maybe that's a telling metaphor for exactly what this was intended to be, if and when we climbed up the ladder to spaceflight, journeyed across space to Mars, and looked down and saw it staring back. Time will tell. Well, from that beginning, my entry into this was when I got a set of these photographs from DiPietro Molinari in the early 80s, and I tell all this in Monuments, so I won't go into any great detail, but what really provoked me about the problem was not only the remarkable detail in their analysis, in their image processing, because they were experts at bringing data out of digital tapes, but the fact that very nearby on the landscape there appeared to be a collection of pyramidal forms. And it's strikingly obvious that these, whatever their origin, they're pyramidal. Now, mountains can be pyramidal. Totally for sure. Mountains can be pyramidal. The interesting thing about these mountains seemed to be that they lay at a 90-degree angle to the center line of the face on Mars. And that, of course, would have afforded them the best view possible out across this level, high desert landscape in the northern deserts at a place on Mars called Cydonia. Well, I'd like to show you a short piece of video at the end of this long analysis done by Dr. Mark Carlotto, who was one of our imaging scientists who unfortunately could not be here this afternoon. Dr. Carlotto has done some stunning 3D graphics and renditions of the original 2D data, making use of state-of-the-art algorithms and technology. We have brought in a lot of experts over the years as part of this loose confederation of scientists and engineers, and the bottom line is that we're trying to apply the best rigors of scientific analysis to a problem that for an awful lot of folks at first blush appears to be beyond the pale of science. So if I could have screen on. I'm interrupting our UN briefing for a moment because for the last 9 years, the argument has raged regarding the reality of this object as a constructed artifact. Well, our focus has now begun to shift. We're looking more at the meaning of this object, including a possible connection with the Earth. For those of you who may not have been following our investigation, however, including our recent briefings at NASA Lewis, for instance, I would like to emphasize some of that compelling evidence. The key to our apparently successful solution to the riddle of Cydonia, which is the name of the region on Mars where Viking initially photographed the face, turned out not to be the face at all, but a 2-mile-long, half-mile-high, 5-sided pyramid located a few miles away. It was Eero Toren, our team member on loan from the Defense Mapping Agency, who cracked the code, because Toren found, when measuring the internal geometry of the D&M pyramid, that it contains incredible geometric structure, fundamental mathematical constants, which in the universe are the key to signifying the presence of intelligence. That's why we term this object the Rosetta Stone of Cydonia. Imagine my intense gratification as I remeasured the relationships between all the so-called anomalous objects we had previously identified grouped around the face and discovered the identical geometry to the D&M, including multiple examples of identical mathematical constants. It was at this point that we began to worry less about the ultimate reality of the so-called face on Mars and more about the meaning of the message of Cydonia. If there was a deliberate meaning behind the incredible geometry now displayed by the monuments of Mars, what could be the meaning? Well, it turns out to center on this figure. This is a four-sided, four-cornered object termed a tetrahedron. And I predict you're going to be hearing a lot more about this object in the years ahead. Because if you put this structure in a sphere, it predicts some remarkable phenomena. For if you put a hypothetical tetrahedra in a planet, the tips touch inside at a key latitude. And at those latitudes, something significant occurs. Watch. Because it turns out that if you look at the D&M, these latitude lines, as they cross, make angles with the interior geometry, and look what we have here, 19.5 degrees and 19.5 degrees, which is confirmation that we have successfully solved the puzzle and decoded the message of Cydonia. And of course, this all relates to the angles that we have encoded in color and to the fact that E prime, or the tetrahedral ratio E, is really square root of 3 divided by 2, which is a fundamental constant. Anyway, so it appears as if we have successfully worked through the puzzle that somebody laid out, and the message of the puzzle is, look to your tetrahedra. Now, what in the world is that supposed to tell us? Okay? Plato notwithstanding. Well, let's look a little further here. You'll notice here that we have a clear, enhanced version of Cydonia. Notice how much better it is than the NASA version. This is a lot of after-hours programming and computer time applied by people outside the space agency, I would like to remind you. Here's the face, here's the city, just the eastern end of it. Here's the D&M down here. Here's this little round thing we call the Tholus. Here's the cliff. Here's this little thing here. What I'm showing here is that the same angles and the same geometry and the same constants, the same relationships, and yes, the same message that we decoded in the D&M has been repeated over and over redundantly throughout the entire complex. Why 19.5? Well, as I looked at the solar system, in my background, I was at the Hoagland Planetarium. I've been a NASA consultant, as Mohammed said. I've been involved in planetary science and astronomy most of my adult professional life. My familiarity with the space program is through the planetary program. I have experienced this extraordinary vicarious thrill through the Voyager missions, as we have literally gone where no one has gone before and seen it on live television. So the first thing I realized when the importance of this latitude became quite apparent was, wait a minute, there's a pattern here. And the pattern is that on every major and minor planet that we have flown by, looked at, or mapped in the last 30 years through NASA imagery, the major disturbance, starting with Jupiter and the Great Red Spot, lies just about at 19.5 north or south. What we think it's trying to tell us is the fact that the internal upwellings of energy on planets, starting with what we term the gas giants in the outer solar system, such as Jupiter, are exemplified by what we will now term circumscribed tetrahedral mathematics. This is time-lapse photography taken during the Voyager mission by Voyagers 1 and 2, an exquisite computer process of fitting together individual frames so you get an actual movie. Notice this enormous vortex, that's what it is, rotating, frozen on the central meridian by the time-lapse cameras and the computer algorithms. We'll get some other close-ups here in a moment. What this is a huge upwelling of internal heat swirling around because of the differential rotation of cloud bands to the north and the south of it. And it sits there for year after year after year after year, rotating every 12 days. Jupiter is so massive, it's 318 times the mass of the Earth, it is fully 10 times the size of the Earth, that this huge atmospheric vortex, which is high up in the Jovian stratosphere and extends to an unknown depth below the visible cloud layers, this vortex is big enough to swallow the entire planet Earth. It has been termed a hurricane, a storm. It is our strong suspicion now that it is not any kind of hurricane or storm that we, the human race, are familiar with. That in fact it is being impelled by a physics that is exemplified by this circumscribed tetrahedral geometry, and the reason it lives at this particular longitude on Jupiter is because that's where the geometry, in terms of the rotation of the planet, wants it to live, mandates that it live. All right? Now, this is the Earth. What happens if I put a circumscribed tetrahedron in the planet known as Earth? Well, over here, you will see that it's right in the middle of India. And over here, you see that it marks the Hawaiian volcano at exactly 19.5 north. And the Hawaiian volcano, screen on, is an exemplification of a huge upwelling of material that's coming up from the outer core of the Earth. And that upwelling has been persisting for at least 65 million years, judging by the enormous lava flows and effusive material that wells out in the center of the Pacific. Isn't it ironic that we can trace the history of this structure back 65 million years to a plume of material energy coming up from the center of the Earth, radially out at 19.5 north? Except on these planets, such as Mars, instead of, which is very like the Earth as a solid surface, instead of having a vortex, what you've got is a volcano, because the energy which is in the core comes up as a plume of rising hot lava, erupts on the surface, spreads out, forms a big pile of cold rock after a while. Without plate tectonics on Mars, this lava pile has grown to a height of over 25 kilometers above the mean and is over 300 miles across. A huge, huge shield volcano, the greatest shield volcano in the solar system. Now this pattern is pretty interesting because the pattern is implying very strongly that we are looking at a physics under the pattern. Incidentally, if you go one tetrahedron vertex over, remember each vertex is 120 degrees of longitude around the planet, you will come to the longitude of Cydonia. You go north 40.87, and there is the face and pyramids of Mars. So the very sighting of the complex appears part of the mathematical message designed to underscore the crucial importance of this geometric pattern to something having to do with fundamental planetary physics and the energy dynamic driving same. Now, are we proposing that there are real tetrahedra buried in planets? No, we're not doing that, no. However, in many examples of physics, you will find mathematical and geometric models of forces that are being modeled geometrically. There is, for instance, an article in Scientific American for the issue following this one that I happened to pick up down at the UN newsstand yesterday afternoon while I was waiting for them to set all this stuff up. And there, and behold, there is a cosmological article based on a topological geometric modeling of the early days of the universe as a reason for why the galaxies are formed where they are and why they have the geometry in terms of each other that they do. So the idea of geometric models as indicators of underlying forces in nature is nothing new. What's new about this is the geometry of this pattern and the fact that something about this pattern is indicating that energy preferentially wants to come up from planetary interiors at 19.5 north and south. Well, this is what you see when you look at these two tetrahedra inside each other. What does it all mean? One of our colleagues, a gentleman named Stan Tennant, is the head of a nonprofit research foundation in California called the Meru Foundation. Tennant and his people have for about 20 years now been looking at a series of ancient texts, the oldest texts on the planet. Literally, Hebraic documents, Greek documents, Arabic documents, Mayan codices, the Rig Veda, all the literature, the great literature of our combined cultural heritage has been focused under their microscope because of a set of clues that Tenon found over 20 years ago, that the letter forms of the Hebrew Bible, the very letter forms of Genesis, are possibly formed by variants of shadow projections of tetrahedral geometry. Now, if this were true, it would have some very major implications. The point of relevance is that in a conversation after we had found this global planetary pattern of inscribed tetrahedral geometry given to us by something as off the wall as a set of artificial structures possibly on Mars, I said to Stan, well, what do you know about tetrahedra? And he said, read such and such by Coxeter and other topologists. For about 100 years, there have been a series of mathematical papers published in the mainstream scientific literature dealing with higher dimensions. We are familiar with length, width, and height, 3 dimensions. 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time. In relativity, it's called space-time as a contraction. However, this rather arcane subculture of scientists, mathematicians, topologists, have been dealing routinely with 4 dimensions spatially, 5, 6, 7, all the way up now to, I believe, 26 individual dimensions. And the mathematics to describe them are literally unreadable, so I'm not even going to begin to try to get into it. The bottom line, however, was that as I read these papers, it became very apparent that in these mathematical treatises there were descriptions of events that would be occurring in 3 dimensions if you were modeling things going on in 4 dimensions or higher and seeing projections, shadows, back into our familiar 3 dimensions. Now, all of these papers dealt with this as theory, as simply, intellectual gamesmanship, mathematical doodling, back of the envelope things. But we're not supposed to really take the idea of other dimensions seriously, right? Well, one of the things that these papers predicted was that if you were to look at the right kind of sphere rotating in the right way in 3 dimensions, what you're really looking at is more of the sphere in higher dimensions projected back into 3 dimensions, and that would produce vorticular roiling motion in the mathematical equation, in the spatial transform, and those roiling vorticular motions would be focused at 19.5 north and south. There is a problem described in this literature called the problem of the 27 lines on the general cubic surface. It turns out to be an elegant description of a ordinary cube in 3 space and what it looks like in higher dimensions, 4, 5, 6 dimensions. And tallying up the number of angles in the cube, there are 2 interpenetrating tetrahedra as part of this solution. And in fact, there is a set of hypertetrahedra that mathematically will fall out as shadows from these mathematical solutions. And as we looked at this figure, it became obvious that if we look at the solar system, we might, if we were seeing the upwelling point of this math, we might see the inwelling point of the same math. The theory being that if you really have a hypersphere, a sphere, a planet that is existing in more than our 3 dimensions, as it rotates, there will be a set of physical forces set up that will transmit back a structure, a signature that you might see on the planet, as we are seeing the 19.5 vortex, which is the first hallmark of any good science. You make a prediction, and then you see if the prediction is fulfilled. Well, when we look at planets, what the predictions said from these papers now, applied to real spinning objects, not theoretical spheres, but real spinning bowls of liquid and gas planets, was that we should see around the poles, particularly the North Pole, a hexagonal pattern, perhaps formed in the clouds. And then I remembered that in 1988, a scientist named D.A. Godfrey had published in Icarus a small paper dealing with time-lapse photography the Voyager missions had taken of the North Pole of Saturn and computer rectified, and lo and behold, there, around the North Pole, is a perfect hexagon, over and over again. And the hexagon is composed of layers of clouds. There are 3 bands, and the clouds are racing backward at about 300 miles per hour, and they're making the turns, each of the turns. The pattern as a whole is rotating with the internal clocked radio period of the planet, which is slightly over 10 hours, I believe, 10 hours, 14 minutes or something like that. That's crucial in a physics, because what it means is the pattern is linked to a property called the bulk angular momentum, the mass spinning of this physical object in 3 dimensions. Now, I mean, look at that. This is stunning, because science is prediction. We now have 2 specific signatures predicted by a formerly theoretical, abstract subculture of mathematical scientists called topologists. And their predictions are that if you rotate a hypersphere, meaning a sphere that extends into more than 3 dimensions that we're familiar with, the effects back from these higher dimensions will give you signatures at 19.5 and a hexagonal pattern in the idealized solution around the rotational pole of rotation. And that, in fact, is exactly what we see. Now, what is that saying? It is saying, screen on, it is saying that perchance, just perchance, during the Voyager mission, we have now secured data that at least one planet in our solar system is somehow connected mathematically to a higher dimensional state space. And that, of course, if we can confirm through further research and further analysis, would be a stunning fact to have beheld. Saturn has lived in our mythologies for so many years simply because it is this place with rings. It wasn't until we sent spacecraft to Saturn and we imaged those rings that we realized that our simple models of this world that were drawn from photographic data based on Earth and not close-up imagery of its clouds and belts and storms and atmospheric patterns taken on site by these spacecraft, that those models were woefully lacking even by current standards of planetary science and physics. For instance, as spacecraft approached over the 70s and into the 80s, it gave us a stunning series of close-ups of these rings. The rings are 171,000 miles from tip to tip. From Earth, they appear to be divided into simple divisions, 1, 2, 3, and they were given designations, the A ring, the B ring, the C ring. But as the Voyager spacecraft showed us image after image of the rings, what did it reveal? It revealed rings, billions and billions, to echo my friend Carl, of junk, of debris, orbiting, whirling around the planet in orbit in periods ranging from a few hours to almost 15 hours. But the debris is orbiting in bands. The rings are banded like a long playing record. And there's no theory extant in current planetary science that can explain the bandings in the rings. As I looked at some of this imagery and I was preparing for this presentation, I had an interesting thought, and that was simply this. Suppose the banding are ripples, higher level ripples in space-time, occasioned in the close vicinity of this extraordinary world by its massive rotation from 3 dimensions into 4 and higher. That we're looking at a literal physical link in our own backyard between the reality of every day and a reality that produces what we think of as the everyday. Because as you look at these objects, these little tiny worlds, this is Mimas, this is a moon that is less than the size of Connecticut. It has a geology and a topology on its own surface that in fact is an amazingly diverse landscape for a tiny chunk of ice that has no internal energy or power source that we can discern. Is it possible that in Saturn, in this spinning ball of liquid hydrogen and liquid helium, banded with clouds, orbiting almost once every 30 years around the center of the solar system, flanked by an exquisite set of concentric and enigmatic rings, that we are seeing an exemplification of the physics of a literal new age. Science is nothing if it's not prediction. The discovery of specific signatures now on planets as diverse as Mars and Saturn, corresponding to predictions made by the monuments of Mars, opens up literally overwhelming possibilities, not just for pushing clouds around on planets or positioning volcanoes, but for something dealing with the sources of the energy to do these things. Let me give you a couple of interesting examples. The Voyager missions a couple of years ago flew by the last planet of the system, Neptune. They measured during the flyby a fact that, inexplicably, Neptune is emitting almost 3 times more energy than it's getting from the sun. Question: where is the energy coming from? No one currently knows. It is our profound suspicion that the physics that we have decoded at Cydonia is telling us about a hyperdimensional source for this new energy. Or take the sun itself. For the last several years, scientists have been looking for nuclear particles supposedly coming from the center of the sun because of its thermonuclear reactions, the kind of chained H-bomb model. Well, for the last 20 years, they haven't found anywhere near as many of these particles as models would predict. In fact, the Soviets and the Japanese, who'd recently brought online experiments to measure fundamental particles, have found none. Is it possible that the very center of our solar system, this incredible blazing ball of gas around which all the worlds in this system orbit, is in fact fueled from another source? The fact, for instance, that its sunspots peak at the key 19.5 latitude may be the clue. Well, this opens up remarkable possibilities which, when we look back at our cultures on this planet and their attention to the sun, others may have also noticed. When we look then at the stars, at the sky at night, we're not seeing chained and imprisoned H-bombs, we're seeing portals to another dimension. And the portals are glowing windows through which we can peer and glimpse the fragments of a physics from another side. What is stunning is when you take that metaphor and you go back and you read the actual Egyptian descriptions and the hieroglyphs for Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. The description is Sirius is a doorway. Now, what did they know? What did they know? Now, if you're looking at that as a 20th century Egyptologist, or as a modern anthropologist, or as any of the academics looking at the history of man and archaeology, the obvious answer is they didn't know anything. It was all primitive superstition. We're going to show you in a few minutes that we have another point of view that we can now buttress with specific mathematical linkages that indicate strongly that the Egyptians, among others, were profoundly aware that the night and the night sky and all of reality is somehow circumscribed by the physics behind the circumscribed tetrahedral geometry given to us now by the monuments of Mars. And that, of course, is an amazing statement to be able to make. But there's another. Because the thought occurred then, after we had figured this part out, the potential, the possibility, that if in fact the sun is a gate to another dimension and the energy we see is merely a lower level transformation of a higher level force or energy or process, then it may be possible to harness such a process on Earth and to create an actual hyperdimensional technology. What could one do in terms of generating energy, electricity, and other phenomena if one could somehow figure out the math of the physics and then apply that in a technology for the betterment of all of us here and now on an Earth in peril with ozone depletion, with resource depletion, with oil limited to a few and needed by the many, all of the problems that civilization is heir to, of scarcity, of want, of privation, of inequality, injustice, all of them could be circumvented if a few simple technologies could be devised that would tap in an unlimited and non-polluting source of energy for the betterment of civilization on this planet at this crucial, defining moment in world history, to quote Secretary Baker. And it was within days of asking that pivotal question about a year ago that I was introduced to the work of a Dr. Bruce De Palma, who was the founder of an institute in Santa Barbara. But before he founded this institute dedicated to the study of exactly this possibility, he taught physics at MIT and Harvard. And for 20 years, Dr. De Palma has been doing a series of experiments basically in rotation in terms of something he calls the N effect. Now, he didn't realize when he coined this term that N could apply as a mathematical term to an N space, in which case we now substitute 4 for N, because it's 4 space that we're perhaps tapping into. Well, needless to say, when Dr. De Palma and I began to have our conversations, one thing led to another, and we were very rapidly introduced to the details of these technologies, and in fact, on the surface, they appear to work exactly as advertised. If you rotate a magnetized object fast enough, and you hook up a conductor so you connect the axis of rotation and the equator, the periphery, a current will flow even though the whole thing is rotating as a unit, and you're supposed to, in current physics, have to have a relative motion between the conductor and the magnet in order to get a current flow. Strongly indicating, in Dr. De Palma's view and in mine as well, that magnetic fields are a property of the hyperdimensional space-time boundary itself and are not produced by the magnet. The magnets are only the transducers. They're only the gate, if you will, whereby the magnetic signature of the higher level state space is manifest in our 3 dimensions. But something even more stunning that he did, and this has got to be replicated, and I would like to issue a challenge to the International School, which is housed here at the UN, to be one of the first schools to try to do this in their physics lab, because any high school should be able to duplicate this. What Dr. De Palma did is he took 2 steel balls, all right, like these little pinballs that you see in the arcades. One of them is motionless. It's not rotating. The other is spinning at 27,000 revolutions per minute, going like a bat out of, well, going like a bat, okay. And they are ejected in a spring mechanism simultaneously at an angle, about a 45-degree angle, all right? Look what happens. The ball that is spinning rises faster, farther, and falls faster, quicker than the ball that is not spinning. And there is absolutely nothing in Newtonian mechanics that can explain that. Nothing. Now, what's interesting is that when you go back and you look at your classical physics texts at Harvard, MIT, whatever, they are always referring to non-rotating objects. Rotation, if it is dealt with at all, is dealt with as one of these terrible complexities in the lab that you can't really get a handle on, so everything is fixed and simplified and grounded and made as simple as possible. Well, it turns out that if this experiment can be replicated by others, then standard classical non-rotating Newtonian physics isn't real. It is a subset. It is an approximation of a real universe, which we'd better get to exploring very seriously, because contained in this, may I say it here in the hallowed halls of the UN, might just be the secret of the control of gravity. And imagine the economic impact if instead of having to ship things around the world by jet plane or boat or around continents by truck or by rail, I could produce a device where they would hover and float frictionlessly, and the energy costs of doing that from here to Perth, Australia were mere pennies. I mean, this is not airy-fairy stuff. If this can be verified, if the experiments can be performed, if the proper tools of science applied to these potentials, then the vision that the President and others who have met in this building have had so long of a new world order can actually come to pass. And the beneficiaries, the first beneficiaries will be those who are now last. the so-called third world. And I would hope that there would be some interest on the part of some members and delegates and staff here to pursue some of these ideas and questions, because the practical benefits for all the peoples of this world at this crucial, defining moment in history, I don't think can be overestimated. The science, however, must be done. And at the moment, it is not being done. Well, this, of course, raises the other great implication and potential of this data, and that is, if we are seeing a connection between a geometry given to us by the monuments of Mars and a physics that applies not just to our neighborhood and the planet we live on and the sun and all the universe we see, but does it also apply to perhaps something in our own history? Is it possible that there could be actual physical links between what took place on Mars so long ago and what has taken place on Earth? Well, as the human species somehow had a contact with a higher intelligence that knows some of these profound universal truths and has tried ever so gently to inculcate their seeds and their gestation and their flowering in the human psyche, in the human condition, and in human civilization. Over the past 9 years, perhaps the most consistently controversial aspect of this work has been the rising specter of a provable terrestrial connection. Even for those for whom the discovery of alien ruins right next door would present no insurmountable theoretical problem, the possibility that that alien presence somehow intervened even hundreds of thousands of years ago on this planet raises some very interesting problems. It was with some trepidation then that to the international community during our UN briefing, we presented the first provable, hard, numerical and photographic evidence of precisely such a alien intervention, including such diverse locations as Giza, Egypt, and Marcoasi, Peru. It began about 9 years ago by noting the curious resemblance of the face to another important monument on this planet. And as I began looking at some references and books and talking with colleagues, this was a sketch done by Shannon, one of our early artists on the team, we both realized that this image was somehow trying to tell us something profound. It was trying to say this. Now, that is totally unscientific. And I wouldn't even bring it up, except that gut feeling, that haunting thing, turned out to have exquisite, almost excruciating confirmation in the years that have subsequently followed. Because the biggest version of that previous image is, of course, this. This is the Sphinx, the largest statue we know created by the human race here on planet Earth, 240 some feet long and 60 plus 66 maybe feet high. The combination of the man-lion. In Arabic, it's called Abu Hol, I believe, which means father of terror. And no one has given me a satisfactory explanation of why it is called the father of terror in Arabic. In the more ancient indigenous Egyptian language, it was called the Ark-Ur. And that is really interesting because as we probed into the etymology, Ark-Ur meant the end of the beginning connected to the beginning of the end, almost like a cycle, like an endpoint, like a constant process, as if it represents the end of something and the beginning of something else. I want to tell you a story of courage by a guy named John Anthony West. John West is a rogue Egyptologist, if you will. He is a writer, raconteur, lecturer, but mostly John has been looking for the last 15 years or so at this object, much as I've been looking at its potential counterpoint on Mars. And he basically has been asking the question, did the Egyptians, in fact, as we know them, do this remarkable structure? Did they create the Sphinx? and all that it implies. The canonical wisdom is that a pharaoh in the 4th dynasty, Old Kingdom, named Khephren, sculpted this being to mimic his own face, set up temples and worship and processes all around it to basically glorify his own dynastic reign. But John, in looking at the weathering, which was drawn to his attention by a gentleman named Schwaller de Lubitz, see, John, I do remember those things, noticed that there was an anomaly here that his contemporary reading of Egyptology simply could not explain. That is, the Sphinx appears to be much, much more heavily weathered than we have any right to expect from only, quote, 5,000 years of desert weathering. Because de Lubitz pointed out that the kind of weathering we see on the Sphinx is best explained by the action of running water. And it was John's immediate thought, water? In a desert? John tried for 15 years to bring actual hard geologists to the study of this profound puzzle, this enigma, this problem. And finally, in the form of Dr. Robert Schoch, who is a tenured professor of geology at the University, Boston University, he found an appropriately open-minded scientist who now has traveled to Egypt, 3 times? And has made measurements, has been allowed in to make measurements with colleagues, people like Boris Said, who was pounding on a seismograph, for a seismologist who was making electronic recordings. And the bottom line is, presented at the GSA conference last year and recently at the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in Chicago a few weeks ago, is this quote by Robert Schoch. The Sphinx outside the pyramid is probably at least twice as old as anyone has ever dared to dream before. Now, that sounds like a relatively minor adjustment in a time scale on a structure that's 6,000 miles away, so who cares? I'll tell you one group who cares. It's the people who write for Jeopardy. The other night on Jeopardy, there was a question, what old monument has recently been dated to twice its former age? And the correct answer was the Sphinx. Unfortunately, they didn't mention John's name, but they will, okay? Because without John, you wouldn't have Bob Schoch involved, and without Schoch, you wouldn't have the scientists, the geologists now looking at it and saying, well, God, it's obvious. You need rain to get that degree of erosion. And you haven't really seen the real erosion, which is down in the cut on the back. 12 feet of it in some places. And that amount of rain has not fallen in Egypt for at least 10, maybe 15 or 20,000 years. Now that raises a profound and wonderful problem. It has the Egyptologists all frothing, you've got to understand. I mean, and they're really frothing at this. I won't go into the skullduggery that is, they've had some things go on that are not really what you expect out of the hallowed halls of academe. But the other fallout is that it means that we're now looking at a structure, a magnificent, monumental work of art created at a time when nobody else on planet Earth is supposedly able to do anything of that magnitude or scale. There's no other contemporary civilization to pin it on. So who did it? And before you say Martians, just sit there and listen, okay? Okay, I don't want you to leap here. Science has now opened. I mean, rigorous science has opened the doorway to what, in I think it was John's parlance, the dreaded A word, Atlantis. Is it conceivable that the mythos that came down to us through Plato, speaking of a prior high civilization capable of things like this, is maybe not a myth? But in fact, we're seeing at least one surviving, albeit very ancient, artifact that you can touch of that halcyon day when we could do things that we no longer can do, or at least that the Egyptians could not do. Again, we don't know, but the science possibilities are there, and they are now being very assiduously followed up by John and his team, and we'll come back in a year or two and we'll report the results. But this opened up, at least politically, the idea that maybe this glimmering resemblance between the face on Mars and the Sphinx was not just whistling Dixie. That maybe there might be if not physical link, at least a cultural passing connection. Something ineffable brushed an earlier phase of human history and left a monument that recorded in some form the echo of that signal. So when we look at the geometry of the monuments of Mars, and we look specifically at the latitude of the D&M, 40.9, and we see that it's E prime, which is the tetrahedral E, divided by pi equals 0.866, all right, which is the front of it. We have to ask ourselves, is it possible we can find a mathematical link, a verifiable, testable link between what we see here and Giza? And the answer is that, in fact, this thing is located about 30 degrees north, and the cosine of 30 north is equivalent to the tangent of 40.868. So, yes, there is a link. There's a mathematical link, the tangent of one and the cosine of the other. And that was kind of interesting. It was certainly more than we had before, but conclusive? Of course not. So, it got us out of thinking. Now you can see this really severe erosion, okay, on the back of it, and you're not seeing the ditch yet. Out in front of the, this is the Great Pyramid here. There's another one here called Kephren, and then one called Mycerinus, and three little guys here, and three little guys over here. What you need to do is you need to look at an overview to get the plan, all right? Here's the Sphinx, here's the Great Pyramid, Kephren Pyramid, Mycerinus, all right? And here's north. Erotorin was the one to discover this. If you lay an Archimedean spiral, which is a version of that equiangular spiral that we have on Mars, on the Tholus, if you lay it such that each of these guys falls on it, all right, the point of it is right here in the desert, and there's nothing there, all right? However, if you then divide east, west, and north, south, the positioning of the Sphinx in relation to the spiral and the pyramids, that ratio of this length to this length is E divided by pi, which is the key constant ratio of Cydonia. The Sphinx is not oriented at random in relation to the pyramids, but according to the key message of Cydonia itself. The basic model of the Sphinx is this lion-man interface. Two creatures. Now, why those two creatures? Why the body of a lion and the head of a man? So, with that as prelude, and the idea that maybe somebody who knew a little bit more than the Old Kingdom Egyptians might have had a hand in this spot on Earth, we began to look seriously at the possibility that there was more than a passing connection between this awesome structure and the monuments of Mars. In particular, the actual image of this thing as the embodiment of these two creatures, feline and hominid. And that's when we began to do a series of enhancements of the face on Mars, which Vladimir Ivinsky, can be credited with somewhat independent discovery and invention. And in his Soviet Life article for August 1984, he called this the Martian Sphinx. Well, take a look. As you progress through the various imaging enhancements, this is high sun now, all right, you can very definitely see that this guy has a simian proto-human look. What you then do is you take the halves, all right, and you fold over. All right, let me go back one. You fold over this half, all right, onto that half so that you can actually get a mirror image, and it's very definitely primitive hominid. It's not Marilyn Monroe or Paul Newman. Why is it primitive hominid? Might it have something to do with how old we think this thing might be? Circa 500,000 years. Hold that thought. Then what we do is we go back to the original, all right, and we then take the right half and we do the same thing. We fold that over and we get this. And I'm really gratified by your response, guys, because that's exactly my feeling. The hair on the back of my neck. When I realized that what we were looking at in the monument of Mars, the face on Mars, was the fusion of the hominid and the feline, the fusion of This persona, from this, I realized that what we were seeing was, of course, sphinxes, literal embodiments of sphinxes on two worlds linked by the fundamental constants of Cydonia over and over and over again. Science is driven by the numbers. In fact, a noted astronomer some years ago, Sir Arthur Eddington, once remarked, "Gentlemen, you do not have a science unless you can express it in numbers." With the discovery of the repeating fundamental E-pi connections now, firmly linking Cydonia and Giza, those numbers are telling us something profound. No longer is a terrestrial connection dismissible as pure projection. In fact, the discovery of the feline nature of the Martian Sphinx raises such implications that we must consider seriously a re-examination of our history in light of Cydonia itself. But independent of our own research, for many years it turns out that others have been pursuing numbers equally intriguing. For instance, there's a gentleman named Carl Monk, an ex-Air Force engineer who for 10 years has been working on something he calls the global grid, or the global matrix. Carl's work, which fills literally rooms of handwritten pages, because he began before the era of cheap calculators, now turns out to be intimately connected with our own work and the monuments of Mars. Carl's work, which came to my attention when he wrote a letter some months ago, and then subsequently joined the Mars mission team, is contained in this book, this volume, which, in fact, contains almost everything you'd want to know about the grid, and don't probably have time to read. 10 years of work. The bottom line is this. This grid, which now apparently encompasses this planet, is specifically connected with the tetrahedral mathematics we've decoded in the monuments of Mars. And it connects such extraordinarily interesting and diverse places on this planet as the Giza Plateau, the fabled ruins at Stonehenge, the sites at Avebury, Silbury, then Guatemala, the Indian mounds of North America, including things like Serpent Mound, and finally, an isolated plateau in the middle of South America, high up in the Andes, 13,000 feet, called Marcoasi. All of these, and by no means is this list comprehensive or exhaustive, all of these now seem to be connected by a system that is both elegant and profound and is rooted in the mathematics that we have discovered at Cydonia. What you probably have to do is to look at this as you would look at a hologram. How many have seen a hologram? It is not a photograph, it is a plate, a photographic plate sometimes, that records on it an interference pattern that is a mathematical transform of the image of which it is taken. And the neat thing about holograms is the whole thing stores the information. But if I take a scissors and I cut the hologram so I get only a tiny piece, and I shine a laser through that, even a piece of the hologram will allow us to reconstruct all the information of the original. So holograms are very well adapted for storing information against entropy where there will be degradation with time. What we seem to be seeing in this global grid, this extraordinary system that Carl worked at independently long before he'd ever heard the words tetrahedral geometry or Cydonia, what we seem to be seeing is a grid, a holographic grid that has structures spotted around the Earth, and there are all kinds of interesting structures, which in fact show us the holographic memory of all different cultures to memorialize the same important few things. And those few things turn out to be E and pi and tetrahedral geometry and, by inference, hyperdimensional physics and an implied technology. And that is an extraordinary statement to be able to make. You're flying up something called the Avenue of the Dead, 30 miles northeast of Mexico City, at a place called Teotihuacan, which to the native Mayans was simply referred to as the place, the dwelling place of the gods. You're flying up the steps of the Pyramid of the Moon, which sits at the end of this long, several mile long avenue. Look at this level here, all right? That angle there is equal to 19.5 degrees. And you turn around here and you look down this avenue. You'll notice that there's another pyramid over here, the Pyramid of the Sun. Its fourth level memorializes 19.69 degrees, which is its latitude on Earth. And that avenue, this long avenue, is off due north by 15.5 degrees. 15.49193338 degrees, which is the mean of all the archaeological estimates of the avenue of the Way of the Dead at Teotihuacan. Multiply it by pi. That's the elegance of this, all right? Simple pi. And what do we get? 48.66934411, which is the radius of Stonehenge. The point is, we are looking at a global matrix. We are looking at a holographic code. We're looking at something whose memory transcends any individual culture. And that's why we have got to pay attention and ask the important questions. Why do we have this here? Who left it to us? And who knew what before? And somehow, why don't we remember what our own heritage has been trying all these years patiently to tell us? When we began this, one of the major questions I had was, well, if you are finding connections with the Earth, then it should show up not only in terms of the numbers, but it should also show up in terms of the forms. That is when I noticed that Silbury Hill, which is south of a place called Avebury, also seems to have a very curious resemblance to the Tholus at Cydonia. As you know, there is this spiral that winds around the Tholus, and here, if you take this cone and you include this enclosure as the actual base, all right, the morphology is eerily identical, including this spiral path that seems to wind down the Silbury Hill, which is the largest man-made earthen mound in all of Europe. Well, Alexander Thom was the one who measured the megalithic yard, which is 2.72 feet, British feet, and now, of course, we don't think that's a coincidence. In fact, that, put together with the methodologies described in Carl's book, make it very clear that the British foot, as a fundamental unit of measurement of tetrahedral geometry, is not only British, it is the unit that was used the world over. It was just called by different names. And it had exactly the same length. And it had to have exactly the same length, or else you could not get the 5 or 10 or 12 decimal precision in the computation of the constants and the grid vectors and all that. That locks you in. The discovery of a global grid now linking these two specific worlds and apparently deriving from a single source, something that occurred at Cydonia, has profound and important implications for us all. Not the least of which is that our weights, our measures, our measuring systems of time, of length, all units of historical reference in the record must now be re-examined to possibly trace their influences and their evolution from some distant point of contact between this world and another. But in the midst of our grasping the enormous implications of this set of discoveries, something else happened, something so amazing that even those of us on the team who have lived with us now for 9 years could not quite believe our eyes, because in the midst of central England, at a place called Avebury and Silbury Hill, some of our team members have discovered and now partially proved perhaps the ultimate terrestrial connection, an analog right here on Earth to Cydonia itself. North of Silbury Hill, which is up here, there is this circular henge monument, the biggest one in England, called Avebury. It has a ditch here, and it has a raised area inside and a mound around the exterior. And normally, you wouldn't think twice about it, except that one of our key people brought this data to my attention This monument happens to have two ancient stone circles. Most of them are now gone. And when Thom measured them many, many, many years ago, guess what? They are aligned off north by 19.5 degrees, which should be pretty familiar by now, and there should be a kind of a warm glow that, we got another one. Oh, it gets better. Remember I promised Muhammad we were going to give him interesting discoveries? Well, here's discovery number 2, major discovery number 2. David Percy, our esteemed producer, who is now up in the booth saying, when is he going to get done? When is he going to wind up? When he looked at this particular photograph some months back, noticing Silbury Hill and Avebury, he flashed on my NASA briefing video from Cydonia, from actually NASA Lewis of Cydonia, and the comparison I made between Silbury Hill and the Tholus at Cydonia, and suddenly he had a vision that not just metaphorically, but maybe actually this could be an analog. And this represents, well, let me show you what he thought it might represent. It might represent this. Okay? Here's the crater, and on the rim there is our little guy, the tetrahedral pyramid. Okay? Now, let's go forward. Here's the Avebury mound outside, the ring of earth pile up. I mean, they dug out this ditch. What were they doing, digging a mile-wide hole with a ring and a ditch and a mound in the middle of a plain in England? Well, David's flash said, what if they were replicating the monuments of Mars? What if the Avebury circle was to represent the crater and Silbury was to represent the Tholus? And he did an overlay. He went to the copy store and he did one of these transparent maps, got an Ordnance Survey map from the British Military Services, raised and lowered the size and scaling until he got an exact match, and lo and behold, this is what he got. And the angles and positions of ancient features, including where the cliff would be and where the tetrahedral pyramid would be, and angles to other key things in this vicinity, all seem to match, including the very size of Silbury Hill in terms of its exterior moat in reference to the Tholus. Well, this, of course, is unbelievable, and I want you to look at this. Here's now is the crater on Mars. Here's the tetrahedral pyramid. You're now looking from this direction at Avebury. Here's the ring here, which it would be up like here. And notice here, there's a mound and a gap. And here's the gap, and there's a separation, and there's the mound, and that's, of course, tetrahedral pyramid. There is something at Avebury which corresponds exactly geometrically. It's a raised portion of the circular pile-up earthen moat around this, corresponding exactly numerically to the tetrahedral pyramid at Cydonia on Mars. And when we do this, get this, we take the grid latitude from Carl of the pyramid, of the Avebury circle, all right, grid longitude, we get its grid vector, and what does the grid vector turn out to be? It turns out to be, hold on to your hats, the average between really 2.7182828282 and the tetrahedral ratio E, the sphere tetrahedron ratio of 2.72069 to 1. That's what that number means, and they positioned, whoever they were, Avebury exactly there in relation to Silbury Hill to be the first means of decoding the meaning of the monuments of Earth. It is quite, this by the way now is the whole Cydonia map from my NASA video, from the briefing that we gave to NASA in March of 1990. And David overlaid the map of England with all these little places with cute names like West Down and the Gallops and Tatesbury Field. I mean, wonderful names. Well, if you now go here and begin to look, would you find a D&M remnant? Would you find the remnants of a city? Would you find all the other things? Well, in November, December, David Myers, our editor and director of operations, went to England and spent 10 days, and he and David Percy went out and visited all these little locations. And the story of what they found is our result, because it looks like we may have the ultimate Earth-Mars connection in Silbury and Avebury and Cydonia. It looks like we may have a Cydonia 2, point for point, grid line for grid line, and perhaps object for object right here on Earth. Now, In hindsight, if we have a global matrix saying there was contact, somebody knew something, and there was some connection at some point in our dim, dim past, does it not stand to reason that part of that memory emplacement of objects and the matrix would actually involve an actual scale model? There's a lot of work to be done. We are not claiming at the moment that we have proven this hypothesis, but we're certainly claiming that there is one heck of a circumstantial case which in future years is going to be pursued, all right, because the only way we're ever going to get to the bottom of it is if we in fact go and drill and bring geologists, but the photographs and the overview that these two gentlemen secured last winter is profound and provocative, and maybe ushering in a new era in the investigation of the monuments of Mars. What we have been dealing with is a mystery that is safely, in most cases, in the past. Ancient Martian ruins, ancient structures around the Earth, a linking grid, but all terming itself history or prehistory. In the last several years, beginning in 1975, which ironically is the year we went to Mars, and continuing on an ascending curve of complexity and numbers, there have been appearing in the fields all around central England, but mostly in a huge equilateral triangle centered around Stonehenge, Avebury, Silbury Hill area, these things: crop circles, the glyphs in the crops. And there has been a tremendous amount of controversy over who was doing them. Why are they being done? Are they hoaxes? Are they natural phenomena? Are they meteorological vortices? Are they electrified winds? Are they merely aberrations of some kind of planet gone mad? Here is a circle that appeared, I believe, last year early. Look at this, all right? Would it surprise you to know that we think it is an exact analog to Avebury, including the fact that this line points west, and when you do that properly, these two circles are 19.5 off north-south? Would it surprise you to know that this circle, which appeared right outside Stonehenge, is trying, obviously, to tell us something about a relationship to what we now know is exquisite math and geometry encoded here, and maybe something encoded there? Would it surprise you to know that on July 17th, this thing appeared outside a place called Barbary Castle, which is overwhelmingly tetrahedral? And we have now, over the last 8-9 months, through a whole bunch of people who can't be here, like Colette Dowell, who not only is doing the math to understand this, but also put together the art exhibit you see over in the south lobby of the Secretariat, and who cannot be here today because of illness, but is certainly with us in spirit. Would it surprise you to know that as you begin to look at the specific numbers and angles of this circle, that we find exact correspondences in the angles and constants and relationships in the D&M at Cydonia on Mars? And that those correspondences extend to subtleties whereby if you connect the centers of the outlying circles, this one goes just a bit beyond, you wind up with 19.5 and 22.5, which of course is the tetrahedral geometry, the tilt of the face-off north, and when you take that center circle and you do this with it, which corresponds to latitudes, you wind up with 69.4, 52, 49.6, 45, 22.5, 19.5, and you divide 45 by 52, and that's what you get, E divided by pi. In other words, this circle, and this is now another level of analysis that Colette has done, embodies in its fine structure the hypertetrahedron, the so-called 5-cell projection of mathematicians like Coxeter and others who've been doodling for the last 100 years. The lines connecting these things bend at exactly the right places. They inflect, saying almost like one of those Lincoln log things where if you put it together this way, the figure that it's supposed to be will pop out of the matrix, and lo and behold, there you will have the clue to what they're trying to say. Now, of course, the problem is that nothing like this should be possible. If you take the same inflection points and you build your tetrahedron, you invert them like so, all right? You wind up with the double tetrahedron, and then you wind up with the beginnings of, from this figure, and this figure alone, if we knew nothing more, two geniuses who confound all geniuses of all time. Because with nothing more than a ruler and a bent pin and an old foggy hat and a string on a board, they are able to do, they say, what none have been able to figure out for the last 10,000 years. Would it surprise you to know that I seriously doubt that Doug and Dave can even spell tetrahedron? Because the math encoded in that one quintessential crop circle alone, this agroglyph, is none other than the hyperdimensional double-inscribed tetrahedron of the physics given to us in the monuments of Mars. Now, the meaning behind this is awesome and profound. It is part of our history now that at the end of every crop circle season, and they begin to appear when the crops are growing, and they disappear after the farmers cut down the last field because there's no more blackboard to write on, obviously. The last circles, the last phenomena, are echoes of the next. Would it surprise you a lot to see that this, as one of the last circles, looks an awful lot like this, which is the Mandelbrot fractal set, and that this appeared in fields just outside of Cambridge, England, where Benoit Mandelbrot went to school? But all of this, to my way of thinking, will not be politically believed unless we go back to Mars. This is how we're going back. This is the unmanned Mars Observer spacecraft departing now in a few short months from the sands of Cape Canaveral to depart on an 11-month journey across space. It'll go into Mars orbit in August of 1993. By December of 93, the formal picture-taking phase of the mission will have begun in earnest. It is our fervent hope and our determination that one of the targets that this spacecraft will image with this exquisite Malin camera, capable of photographs 50 times sharper than we currently can see, will be the monuments of Mars, the objects clustered at Cydonia. Because politically, if those objects are real, and if they are artificial, and if they contain the mathematics and geometry that we now impute they do contain, then when those images come back and are shown to us live, all over this planet on global television, at that moment, the world begins anew. All the possibilities I've laid out in the last hour or so will then become possibles. All the possibilities will, in fact, become pregnant with such possibilities that physicists and politicians and diplomats and ordinary folks, no matter what their lineage and background and heritage and culture, who all share an aspiration for a better future and to understand their roots, that heritage will come to the fore, and we will have walked through a crucial doorway in human history. But it is not going to happen unless we force and pressure NASA, the space agency, to take the pictures and make them public. Now, are we alone in this? Well, apparently not. Two official seated members to this august body, the nation of Grenada and Sierra Leone, have now issued official stamp sets commemorating the monuments of Mars and the coming exploration of Mars, and the fact that on behalf of all mankind, if those photographs from Mars Observer do get taken in December of 1993 or shortly thereafter, and they are immediately made public and they verify what we strongly suspect, the global community, all of mankind, stands to benefit. The standard parlance of history has to always been to view the unknown in fear and dread and sometimes terror. As I hope I've shown you this afternoon, we are confronted with an unknown that holds not fear, not dread, not invasion, none of those negatives, but the potential to transform the human condition physically, spiritually, materially, intellectually, and culturally beyond anything the world has known for a long, long time. Because part of the message of the monuments of Mars and the potential connection with the monuments of Earth is that these are things that we have known before. Whether we're Arabs or Jews or Christians or Hindus or of any ism, the fact is we all, according to the images and data in the stones and in the fields, we share a common bond. We share something in our heritage that is now pointing us toward a shared common future. That's why I've come here to show you this data, because ultimately we all must find out what waits us there. Thank you, and good afternoon.
Liftoff of the Titan III rocket with the Mars Observer and America's return to the Red Planet.
On September 25th, 1992, we finally headed back to Mars. Atop a Titan rocket, the Mars Observer spacecraft has now officially resumed unmanned Martian exploration after a 17-year hiatus by our space agency, NASA. Hello, I'm Richard Hoagland. 11 months from now, in August 1993, when Mars Observer is successfully placed in Martian orbit, we may finally know the answers to many of the questions raised by the ongoing Cydonia investigation. As previously noted, Mars Observer is carrying to Mars the Malin camera, capable of reimaging the Martian landscape at levels of resolution 50 times better than any images we have ever seen before. The images Mars Observer captures should remove any reasonable ambiguity regarding the reality of Cydonia as a design complex, with all the implications. But incredibly, there is now growing doubt that we will see new Cydonia images from Mars Observer. Since our UN briefing, our campaign, because of this, has shifted slightly. Our original effort, designed to extract a guarantee from NASA that Mars Observer would indeed take and publish new Cydonia images, has changed. In the days before the launch, NASA finally admitted that Cydonia pictures were, quote, on the Mars Observer list. But for the first time, NASA would embargo release of all images gathered by the spacecraft. The current position on disclosure is to provide no live television of the spacecraft's imaging. Never in the entire history of NASA has this occurred. Instead of live TV, as on all previous missions, NASA will, quote, wait 1 or 2 weeks to dole out a few images it decides are of general interest. It will be 6 months to a year before a full set of the thousands of images expected from the spacecraft is released, but there is still no guarantee that we will see all images, including the critical Cydonia shots, because without uncensored live TV, NASA is not accountable to anyone. We must take their word. NASA's unprecedented decision to broadcast no live television raises the ugly possibility of censorship. The current disclosure policy makes it conceivable that pictures proving the existence of ancient Martian artifacts could be withheld. This new policy must not remain unchallenged. If you want to make sure that we see all the data Mars Observer gathers, please write to Congressman George E. Brown of California. And here is his address. The Honorable George E. Brown, Chairman, House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, Rayburn Office Building, Suite 2320, Washington, D.C., 20515. Since our UN presentation in February of 1992, our continuing investigation has turned up something quite remarkable. Hard evidence of existing technology, apparently based on the same new physics I outlined at the UN. The technology you're about to see is an extraordinary example of capabilities which must exist if the hyperdimensional physics we've decoded through Cydonia is right. The video we are about to show you was shot by your friendly local neighborhood space agency, NASA, and comes to you courtesy of Don Ratch, an independent investigator who acquired the original footage from the live NASA satellite transmission. Don took the first hard look at what this video actually shows. The sequence begins aboard the Discovery space shuttle, rolled over on its side and flying wings forward into the pre-dawn darkness of September 15, 1991. The shuttle is in orbit 355 miles above the Earth, just passing Rangoon, Burma, that brilliant collection of city lights below.
Discovery Houston, while you're looking at Orion, we're getting a pretty tremendous light show. We're looking at the lightning on the Earth.
Yeah, I was looking at that myself, and looks like we're coming up on sunrise.
10 minutes later, it passes over Surabaya on the island of Java, heading southeast for the coastline of Australia. The shuttle is flying toward dawn at slightly under 18,000 miles per hour. The dotted yellow line on our computer plot marks sunrise on the Earth's surface. Everything to the right of this line is in daylight. Everything to the left is still in night. To orient you, the glowing curved line, unevenly dividing the dark upper right portion of your screen from the larger gray tone portion to the lower left, is the airglow layer of our atmosphere. It begins about 40 miles above the surface of the Earth and dissipates at an altitude of approximately 60 miles. Don't confuse this glowing line with the actual solid horizon of the planet, indicated on the NASA video by the little electronic registration marker at the upper left. This real horizon is slightly darker, opaque, 40 miles below. That's the actual Earth's surface. Remember, the shuttle is flying 355 miles above that surface, about 300 miles in airless space above the airglow. Now pay attention to your screen at the top center. You will see a dot of light appear and begin to move from right to left. Watch carefully. The dot will turn hard right in apparent response to a brief flash from the lower left. 3 seconds later, two contrails move sharply upward from the lower left. In my opinion, the NASA shuttle video you have just seen is among the most extraordinary pieces of footage in television history. I know that's quite a statement to make about a set of glowing dots that may appear to some more like mere fireflies in orbit, and to others like a boring video game at best. But we will demonstrate that those fireflies are in fact visual proof from NASA's own live cameras of some kind of hyperdimensional vehicles performing in Earth orbit, precisely as we predicted in our UN speech. In fact, as we shall show, some of these dots are going fast enough to go from New York to Perth, Australia, a distance of over 12,000 miles, in less than 4 minutes. And what appears to be something shooting at them? Well, we'll get to that. Some of you may have seen parts of this extraordinary NASA footage elsewhere. It's made the rounds of several national television shows. It's also become something of a classic among UFO enthusiasts who see the extraordinary physics and automatically assume we're seeing aliens. From NASA, the official explanation of what you've just seen is that it's anything but aliens or high-performance spacecraft. Under the general category of space debris floating near the shuttle, NASA has identified these fascinating objects as everything from bits of insulation floating out of the shuttle's cargo bay in front of the cameras to chunks of ice from a urine dump on a previous orbit. Here's what real chunks of ice in orbit look like. This is ice separating from the upper stage of a 1960s Apollo mission to the moon. Note the behavior of true bits of ice in weightless orbit. They move in straight lines. They don't make sharp turns, and they move at constant speed, with no sudden speed-ups or decelerations. To dramatize that comparison, look at this split screen. On the left, the NASA shuttle video. On the right, ice from Apollo. Note the difference. Constant motion of the ice, rolling, moving, separating, compared to the hovering behavior of most of the Discovery objects that September morning in 1991. Let's take another look at this split screen, but this time with the video replayed at high speed. Using this technique, the radical difference in motion between the ice particles and the objects photographed by the space shuttle is truly evident. This peculiar dynamic behavior of the strange glowing objects distinguishes them from the simple chunks of ice or other debris in orbit. When you see the shuttle video in fast motion, the stunning anomalous movement of these anomalous objects really stands out. When I first saw the shuttle tape, I was overwhelmed. If these are not mere ice flakes or something equally mundane, their existence and their behavior is confirming the fundamentals of our entire hypothesis and 10-year investigation. But to confirm that these are solid objects, performing far beyond the current laws of physics, we must somehow determine the distance to these objects. How far from the shuttle and this camera are they? Answer that question, and you have your undeniable proof. Put another way, if we can prove that these objects we are seeing are in the atmosphere, then they have to be at least several hundred miles from the shuttle's camera. To see ice or other debris at that distance, it would have to be bigger than the shuttle itself. Because the shuttle video is two-dimensional, a flat TV screen, at first there appears to be no way to determine the critical depth of what we're seeing, how many feet or miles or thousands of miles these objects may be in front of the camera lens. To determine actual speeds and velocities and accelerations, we must have this crucial third dimension, distance. Several experts who have seen the shuttle sequence, both inside and outside NASA, say it's impossible to determine the distance of any of the objects from the camera given only the information presented on the video. Here's why they're wrong. The physical horizon of the Earth is the distance reference visible throughout the entire NASA video. The fact that one key glowing object seems to come up over that horizon was to us a vital clue to the possible importance of this fixed reference point in space to solving the entire distance problem from the shuttle. So let's look at our video again in close-up. Pay careful attention to what I call the target object, which now suddenly pops on, then moves smoothly to the left. Its behavior is exactly like something suddenly popping into view by coming over the physical, very opaque horizon of the Earth. Let's take another look at that. If we can prove that that's exactly what we're seeing, then this simple fact, if we can establish that it is a fact, automatically fixes the object's distance in relation to the shuttle as the distance to that horizon, and the airglow 40 miles above it. Simple high school geometry, once we know the orbit altitude, automatically determines the distance to this glowing limb. The answer is 1,713 statute miles. Now let's make a second observation. At the peculiar flash, the dot immediately turns hard right and undergoes extreme acceleration, heading upward on our two-dimensional TV screen across the airglow limb. This limb, which we have just established is some 1,700 miles from the space shuttle, physically marks the boundary between the upper atmosphere and airless space. At the precise moment that our object crosses this bright limb, it dims out as if someone was turning down a light. Could there be a physical connection? If the object's brightness is somehow dependent on the atmosphere itself to support its brilliant glow, then physically, on leaving such an atmosphere, the object might indeed behave as we are seeing. This second observation, then, is a completely separate piece of evidence, strongly supporting that the glowing object we are seeing is at the physical horizon of the Earth, in the atmosphere, some 1,700 miles from the shuttle's TV camera. If the glowing dot were only debris lit by sunlight, as NASA flatly argues, the object's sudden upward motion must make it brighter because it's flying into growing daylight. Instead, the dot grows dimmer, consistent with a much more distant physical location, because the Earth's horizon, 1,700 miles behind the shuttle, is still in total darkness. Does this finally prove that our dot is physically in the atmosphere at the Earth's horizon? Almost, but not quite. The proof came from the Analytical Sciences Corporation in Reading, Massachusetts, courtesy of my colleague and co-investigator on this problem, Dr. Mark Carlotto. You might recall it was Mark's imaging techniques and fractal analysis which has provided the substance of much of the Cydonia investigation. Using state-of-the-art computer technology, taking the NASA video apart literally frame by frame, Mark developed the conclusive evidence to complete our case. The proof involves something that so far we haven't talked about. In fact, as far as we know, no one's discussed this in any of the video presentations of the data. If you look carefully at the monitor, you'll see that in the upper right-hand portion of the screen, in that area of space, that dark, dark background, there are glowing things, glowing dots. These dots are stars, light years, literally, beyond the horizon and beyond the Earth itself. Those dots are moving downward because the shuttle is moving toward you in Earth orbit, and basically the stars are setting behind the atmosphere of Earth. If we look carefully at those glowing dots, we see that we can match the trails over very long periods of time, 10, 20 minutes, and they do not change direction. At the flash, this peculiar brightening of the television screen that we've been examining now for some time, what we see after the flash is that those star trails continue to move down unchanged. NASA's explanation for the flash is that you're seeing a thruster firing aboard the shuttle. If this were true, the thruster firing would change the attitude of the entire shuttle and therefore the direction of the setting stars. Since this does not occur, this cannot be the explanation for what we've been observing. The other reason the stars are important has to do with what Mark discovered in terms of comparing their brightness to our little dot. What I have here is a little simulation of our object, and what I'm going to do is to move it down behind this simulation of the Earth as it appeared that night in orbit far above our planet. Way out there, some 1,700 miles away, is our space shuttle. If I bring this glowing object down representing starlight, notice what occurs. As the star passes down behind the atmosphere of Earth, it changes brightness, and when it goes behind the solid planet, it disappears entirely. Exactly what should occur with something light years distant behind the planet we are living on. However, let's look at what happened when our little dot appeared. It came up from behind the Earth in our current model, moved along the curved horizon, such as this, and when it got to this point after 15 seconds, the flash occurred. It then zoomed sharply upward through the air glow layer and onward into space. Now notice what happens as it goes behind the air glow. What Mark discovered is that, like the stars, it brightened, and then it dimmed on leaving the Earth's atmosphere. Since starlight is coming from light years farther from the shuttle than the Earth, these two brightness sources add the air glow and the stars. By the same reasoning, since our object was brightened as it passed across this air glow layer, the calculations say that this object had to also be at least as far away from the space shuttle as the air glow, therefore fixing its distance in terms of simple physics as 1,700 miles away. Since we have now established beyond any reasonable doubt this fascinating object's distance from the shuttle, the rest is easy, if slightly unbelievable. Our little dot is in fact drifting along at a leisurely pace of some 15 miles per second. That's about 54,000 miles per hour. We say it's drifting because when you see our little target object react to that peculiar flash that you're quite familiar with by now, the undisputed star of our update accelerates in less than 2 seconds to over 200,000 miles per hour. And for those of you who may be wondering how many G's this little guy experiences when it accelerates in reaction to that flash, its numbers clock out at a cool 14,000 times the Earth's gravitational acceleration. A force of 14,000 G's is roughly equivalent to dropping a 10-story building on top of you. 200,000 miles per hour in less than 2 seconds, 14,000 G's. Obviously, nothing in our space technology can even begin to approach numbers like this and have pilots survive. In fact, nothing in our known laws of physics provides for propulsive performances and capabilities such as those we've just observed. But this is well within, in fact, it is implicit in any hyperdimensional technologies capable of literally altering gravity. Based on the laws of physics, we believe we have now carefully decoded in the monuments of Mars and in our ancient artifacts on Earth. So what about that flash and those 2 streaks? Some UFO enthusiasts claim that what you're seeing are shots from some kind of Star Wars weapon system firing at alien spaceships bent on Earth invasion. I think not. Based on reasoning similar to what we've just exhaustively described, we have calculated the actual velocities of these 2 peculiar streaks of light. They are indeed consistent with a much publicized Star Wars weapon system from the Pentagon called brilliant pebbles, essentially a high-tech shotgun burst of thousands of tiny plastic pellets, accelerated to about 1,000 miles per second by an electromagnetic accelerator called a railgun. If this is true, the flash you're seeing is not light. It's an effect in the camera created by the electromagnetic pulse that accelerates the brilliant pebbles. Quite a weapon, but no match for a vehicle capable of nimbly darting away at over 14,000 Gs, as we've seen. The target, you now see why we've been calling our little glowing dot by this peculiar name, in fact evades this shot with ease. This and a host of other actions by all the other anomalous dots present in this sequence, which we haven't time to talk about, has led us to this amazing conclusion, that the shuttle cameras that night somehow showed us an active Star Wars weapon system in Earth orbit, and the system is using our own American hyperdimensional technology for target practice. So I don't think we're seeing a battle in outer space at all. But I do think this remarkable video sequence is evidence of a different kind of battle inside NASA. Why did we get to see what we have seen? Our explanation is that someone very highly placed inside the agency wanted us to see this sequence live and arranged for the shuttle to literally beam it to the entire world on live TV that night. A truly extraordinary leak of what has to be the world's most secret military program. This is not just wild-eyed speculation. There is a document which was uncovered in the 1980s, declassified by the Air Force from the Wright-Patterson Technical Library in Ohio, that in fact reveals in the 1950s, for approximately 10 or 20 years, this nation, all the major aerospace companies were engaged in research on electrogravitic technology. Electrogravitics is basically the control of gravity. In 1958, after a special conference arranged among all these players by the Air Force, all reference to this technology in the open literature disappeared. But underground, quietly, with secret black-budgeted money, who knows what by now these people and these processes could have developed. In fact, it's possible that you have just seen what 30 years of monies have procured. We don't know all the facts as yet. But since this video sequence of the space outside the shuttle was beamed live to Earth in September of 1991, all subsequent transmissions from any of the outside shuttle cameras on all recent shuttle flights have electronically been scrambled. And now we're told we will not be seeing Mars on live TV. This is unconscionable. But in this country, in this nation, because of our Constitution, it is not unchangeable, and you can change it. Simply write to Congressman George Brown. I'm Richard Hoagland. Thank you for watching.